So this is my project on Sputnik 1. Beginnings and statistics. In the USSR, the rocket development program took an energetic start under Stalin, and the idea of a manned spaceship and a satellite was naturally crystallizing along with it. Just to show how serious of a plan the Stalin regime had, here is a direct quote from the Russian space web. As the Soviet authorities forcefully sent German rocket specialists into the USSR, the chief of the group, Helmut Grotov, asked Minister Dmitry Ustinov when they could return home. As soon as you make rocket fly around the world, was reportedly his reply. Mikhail Tikhonov was supposed to create a satellite and have it launched from the new R-7 ICBM rocket, and that was going to be the Soviet Union's first ever satellite in space, but it was not ready, so Sergei Korolev quickly made Sputnik 1 as a replacement, and that was the first ever artificial satellite. Sputnik 1 was ready for launch in 1957, with its first and last launch being on October 4th, 1957. It weighed 185 pounds and was 22 inches across. It only lasted in space for 21 days, but it did its job. And Sputnik means fellow traveler in Russian. So, picture on the bottom right, that's Tikhonov on the left and Korolev on the right. The launch system. So, Sputnik's launch system was the R-7 ICBM. More specifically, it was an R-7 8K71PS rocket. This was a relatively unmodified version of the R-7 original rocket, however. It was different, so there were 4 test flights that were needed before Sputnik 1 was launched, and this is significant because they really wanted to get the satellite in the air as soon as possible. They wanted to launch it in correlation with the International Geophysical Year, which was a solar period that the International Council of Scientific Unions declared would be ideal for the launching of artificial satellites to study the Earth and solar system. Some modifications of it included the removal of things like the military warhead, some flight control hardware, and the radio control system. Radio transmitters, however, were included on the flight. Sergei Korolev's history. So Sputnik 1 was created and designed by Korolev. He spearheaded the whole process, and the bureau that was responsible for the project was the Korolev Bureau. He was an aerospace engineer that was born in Ukraine, and he became interested in aeronautics and rockets at a very young age. He was a victim of Stalin's purges and was a political prisoner, but he later went on to become the chief designer of the Soviet space program. And just some of the things that he was involved in while he was the chief designer, obviously Sputnik 1, the first flyby of the moon by a space probe in 1959, the first flight by a man, which was Yuri Gagarin in 1961, and Valentina Tereshkova's flight in 1963, which was the first space flight by a woman. Korolev was given no public recognition until his death in 1966 because his identity was kept secret from the public. He was known as chief designer in all press releases and newspapers, and he now has a statue in Moscow, which is the picture in the very upper right-hand corner. Missions. Only one mission was flown for Sputnik 1, but it was successful. The launch was only 12 years after World War II, which was remarkable because the USSR was completely demolished during World War II. It was launched at 7:28 p.m. on October 4th, 1957 from Baikonur Cosmodrome in Tyradum, Kazakhstan, which was then part of the Soviet Union at the time. It was the first artificial satellite ever, and it transmitted signals for 21 days back to Earth. It was able to study the atmosphere and send that data back to Earth, like I just said. The payload was 185 pounds, the orbital period was 1 hour and 36 minutes, and the speed was 18,000 miles per hour. And this here is a map of where Tyradum is and was in relation to the rest of the USSR. So at the time, the USSR's border were the white borders all along here, and the current borders of all the countries are yellow. So it's circled in red right there. The current state, Sputnik 1 only had one launch and it was successful. It transmitted signals for 21 days and then burnt up into the atmosphere, and that was the end of it. It was just a one-use satellite. Down on the bottom right is a view of the inside, or what we thought the inside would look like, and then a replica up in the top right. Historical impact. The launch of Sputnik 1 is widely known as the beginning of the space race. Many Americans feared more fatal uses of the Soviets' new rocket and satellite technology, which was strides ahead of the U.S.'s space effort. So that just means nuclear annihilation. That was a big fear at the time. You can see the picture in the bottom right illustrates that a little bit. Sputnik was some 10 times the size of the first planned U.S. satellite, which was not even scheduled to be launched until the next year at the time of the launch. The U.S. government, military, and scientific community were caught off guard by the Soviet technological advancement. They were caught off guard partly because it was only 12 years after World War II, like I said a couple slides ago. And the launch was perceived as a threat by politicians in the U.S. The media also presented it as a big threat. And because of that, the U.S. population's perception was mixed. A lot of people agreed that it was a great threat to the country, but others thought it was a big achievement for mankind holistically. Um, the launch did undermine some fundamental narratives in U.S. politics, such as our technological superiority and our economic superiority. And the launch posed some questions if the U.S. technological development was sufficient enough and if human development was also good enough. And some politicians, when they were talking about this, threw around the term second rate power. Politicians and high level businessmen advertised the launch of Sputnik and made sure as many people saw it as possible in an effort to raise funds for the US's space expeditions. They used the public's fear and lack of knowledge on the public to get money. So that's where the media comes in. They really wanted to push that it was a bad thing so that the US really could raise funds and try and catch up with the USSR. Cultural impact. The launch was a wake up call for the US political class and business elite. They now knew that to compete with the USSR and catch up with them, they needed to invest in the American people now. Emphasis on science and technology were implemented into the education system, and NASA was created. On the long term, this led to the digital age, and overall, Sputnik kicked the US into high gear and got them to start accelerating growth towards space. A lot of political cartoons, just like the one in the bottom right, as well as images and articles, were in newspapers and on television in the days and weeks following the launch. This was part of the effort to get Americans invested in the space race. And like I said, the government was looking for their money and support. Economic impact. So Sputnik 1 cost in 1985 money was $33 million, and I translated that into today's money, and it is almost $92 million. This is a whole lot of money for only one launch, especially in that time, but it was well worth it from the Soviet Union's eyes. Politicians wanted to make the U.S. economic system more fair after the launch. They realized that they needed average American people to try and progress and develop economically because there was a need for a higher level of human development to keep up with the USSR. Jobs at the time meant you were living paycheck to paycheck, and college meant that you were just going to be in debt for most of your life, and that needed to end. Even though Sputnik was bad for Americans at the time, a lot of people were afraid. The competition that it brought helped create many things that were economically beneficial to the U.S. Things like the internet, weather monitoring, climate change were all created or rejuvenized because of this. And NASA, which was also created, invented things like insulin pumps, freeze-dried food, bleh, memory foam, antifreeze, cochlear implants, and so much more. So the launch really helped propel the United States to take more steps and more time educating in science and math in schools. They didn't even have enough teachers to teach all the kids at the time, but that problem was solved almost immediately after the launch of Sputnik 1. More time and money were invested into future generations because of the need for higher level of human development. So in conclusion, uh, the Soviet Union launch of Sputnik 1 caused what is called and known as a Sputnik moment for the United States, opening our eyes to our own faults and shortcomings and sparking an era of great American scientific achievement, economic growth, and common purpose, all of which laid the groundwork for an eventual victory in the Cold War. And I have my um, websites, my sources for the first two slides here, the next two slides here, or first three, no, three here, two here, and two here. Yeah, and that's all.